Hey everybody, and welcome to There and Back Again. I'm Alistair Stevens, and tonight in our 25th session exploring Tolkien's Middle-earth, we're going to close out the first half of the Fellowship of the Ring. We're reading Chapter 12, Flight to the Ford. We're going to see Frodo and Strider and their companions dash along the East Road all the way to the Ford of Brune and right to the gates of Rivendell itself. And then we're going to take a little break because we're not going to get to Rivendell until next week's reading. Thank you for joining me on this unusual Sunday evening session. I had to reschedule from earlier in the week, but that I think has been wildly beneficial because on Friday night, I held the weekly Point North Media live Q&A stream on a non-YouTube broadcast platform called Crowdcast. And we may be switching to that platform in the near future. For those of you watching at home, that will have almost no effect. For those of you listening to the podcast, that will have absolutely no effect. But that platform is very interesting. And I mentioned that right at the top of tonight's show because, well, next Thursday, we're going to move into Book 2 of the Fellowship of the Ring. But between now and then, there is a non-zero chance that there will be an extra bonus episode of There and Back Again, in which I take some listener questions and possibly hang out with some of you live. That will probably take place on Crowdcast. So stay tuned for that. I'll try and spread the information about that as soon as I possibly can. As ever, you can follow Point North Media on Twitter. You can subscribe to the newsletter at pointnorthmedia.com, or you can follow me personally on Twitter at paperbullets. I retweet most of the things there. And also, if you watch YouTube after the fact, then any recordings that I do on Crowdcast will be uploaded to YouTube as well. So if you're not a live viewer, but you like the convenience of the YouTube interface, particularly if you're watching from work, which I know at least one person is live in the YouTube chat right now, then you'll still be able to visit YouTube and take part in the discussion, albeit some removed, displaced, if you will, in time. It's great to have you all here. We have Glorfindel, and we have Becky, and we have Dan, and we have Skipa is joining us here from the depths of the Scottish night. It is very, very late over there in the UK, so I'm very grateful for you being here, Skipa. It Don't Connect is here, Gildarts Winters and Princess Ostrich and Kim. It is lovely to have you all here for this discussion because this is a really interesting chapter. This is one of those chapters which sets up a lot, which we're going to discuss next week, and then in the following week when we get to the Council of Elrond, chapter 2 of book 2 of the Fellowship of the Ring. But in itself, this chapter gives us a fascinating perspective on what life is like in Middle-earth, what life is like for our protagonist, Frodo, and for his companions here at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring. Last time we saw the battle at Weathertop against the Nazgul, and Frodo took his grievous injury there. And here we're going to see the consequence of that, and that is a consequence which, at least as it's presented to us initially, and ultimately as it is presented to us in its entirety, gives us a great perspective on good and evil, light and dark, mortality, healing in the realm of Middle-earth. So there's a lot to discuss, but we're going to begin with a little pedantry, I suppose. We're going to begin by going backward. Let me show you, first of all, the map that I have taken to show you here at the beginning of each session of There and Back Again. And you will see now that we are focused on the eastern half of Eriador. Here we are focused on Weathertop to Rivendell, basically to the Ford of Brune, the Loudwater that you can see there. And between the two, you can see the last bridge. The last bridge, the bridge crossing the Horwell before we get to the Bruinen, is those two rivers are separated by the Troll Shaws. These are the Etin Moors that Strider will refer to. Etin being an old Anglo-Saxon word meaning giant or troll, and moor, of course, simply meaning a high and desolate place. So to the north of the Troll Shaws forest there, we have the Etin Moors. You can see them just in the shadow of the northern spur of the Misty Mountains, just to the right of where it says, "Here was of old the witch realm of Angmar." We're going to talk a little more about the witch realm of Angmar, and certainly the witch king of Angmar as we move through tonight's reading. But this gives us an interesting geographical inconsistency when compared with The Hobbit. Let's take a look at a slide taken from chapter 2 of The Hobbit, Roast Mutton, which we discussed, well, we discussed mathematically 23 weeks ago, I suppose. It feels like forever since we talked about the beginning of The Hobbit, but this is the slide taken from chapter 2. Still, the dwarves jogged on, never turning round or taking any notice of the hobbit. Somewhere behind the grey clouds, the sun must have gone down, for it began to get dark as they went down to a deep valley with a river at the bottom. Wind got up, and willows along its banks bent and sighed. Fortunately, the road went over an ancient stone bridge, for the river, swollen with the rains, came rushing down from the hills and mountains in the north. It was nearly night when they had crossed over. The wind broke up the grey clouds, and a wandering moon appeared above the hills between the flying rags. Then they stopped, and Thorin muttered something about supper, and where shall we get a dry patch to sleep on? Then there's a brief pause while the dwarves chat amongst themselves about the sudden and surprising absence of Gandalf, and then we get, they all sat glum and wet and muttering, while Owen and Glóin went on trying to light the fire and quarrelling about it. Bilbo was sadly reflecting that adventures are not all pony rides and May sunshine, when Balin, who was always their lookout man, said, "There's a light over there." There was a hill some way off with trees on it, pretty thick in parts. Out of the dark mass of the trees, they could now see a light shining, a reddish, comfortable-looking light, as it might be of fire or torches twinkling. When they had looked at it for some while, they fell to arguing. Some said no, and some said yes. Some said they could go and see, and anything was better than little supper, less breakfast, and wet clothes all the night. So here we see at the beginning of The Hobbit, in chapter 2 of The Hobbit, the hobbits cross the last bridge and then immediately see the light of the trolls' encampment. As you probably remember, Bilbo goes off to investigate, finds the three trolls, is captured, the dwarves are also captured, and things look pretty grim for our hero until the sun comes up and the trolls are turned to stone. So here is the geographical inconsistency. In The Hobbit, the troll encampment is clearly a short walk from the river. In The Lord of the Rings, it is super not. Frodo and company spent 5 or 6 days traveling from the last bridge to the troll encampment. We know it is the same bridge. It is the only bridge across the only river in this part of the world. Specifically, Frodo and company crossed the last bridge on the 13th of October, reached the troll camp on the 18th of October, then reached the ford of Bruinen on the 20th of October, which pushes Bilbo's encounter with the trolls far to the east and much, much closer to Rivendell. Now, this is, as Nikki notes here in the YouTube chat, a big difference. This is a very significant geographical inconsistency. And this is not something of which Tolkien was unaware, and it was certainly not something about which Tolkien was unconcerned. This is one of the major contributing factors to the abandoned 1960 revision of The Hobbit. I say revision. I suppose page 1 rewrite would actually be more appropriate. This is the version of The Hobbit that Tolkien began in 1960. He went back to The Hobbit to rewrite the thing in its entirety, to bring it more in line with The Lord of the Rings. Now, when we talk about the 1960 rewrite, we're basically talking about tone and tenor. It is going to be much more serious. It is going to be much more epic. It is going to be much more grand. It is going to draw upon the quest of Erebor and other accounts of Bilbo's journey. It is basically going to leave behind the fairy tale concessions of The Hobbit and bring that story right slap bang into accord with The Lord of the Rings. And one of the major things that Tolkien wanted to do was address the geography, particularly in this part of the journey, the journey from the Shire to Rivendell, and then also the phases of the moon, which are, if you've read The Hobbit, wildly inaccurate and internally inconsistent. So he started work on this in 1960, and he basically rewrote the first, I guess, 3, maybe 4 chapters, or 3 chapters of The Hobbit, and brought it up to this epic, elevated tone. And then he passed those chapters to a friend who said, "This is great, but it isn't The Hobbit." And Tolkien agreed and abandoned that rewrite. But this is exactly the kind of geographical detail that he wanted to address, that he wanted to revise. And had he lived a while longer, perhaps we would have had another 3rd, 4th edition of The Hobbit, where some of this stuff was addressed. There were minor revisions made to The Hobbit, of course, throughout the life of the book, the publication history of the book, to account for The Lord of the Rings. It isn't just a simple 1st edition, 2nd edition, history to that manuscript. But this kind of suggests to us how important Tolkien thought the geography was. This land was supposed to be completely consistent between the 2 books. But I have to say, reading this chapter and the last chapter too, in all honesty, I don't get the sense of this part of the world from Bilbo's perspective. This just feels incompatible with The Hobbit. That's more in the tone of an observation rather than a criticism, though, because, as I say, the professor was well aware of this and wanted to address it. I like the movement of the trolls' encampment away from the last bridge and much closer to the ford of Brunnen, because of course it speaks to that continuing journey, that continuing series of thresholds that kind of demarcate Bilbo's journey east as he's heading out toward the Lonely Mountain. We talked about that all the time back when we were discussing The Hobbit. Threshold after threshold after threshold, this graduation into the wild. And I think that there is a powerful demarcation here between the civilized lands in the West. I mean, the Shire, of course, being ultimately civilized. And we can talk too a little about what lies west of the Shire and the degree to which those lands are, in some senses, even more civilized. That is to say, they are even less touched by the wild. But as Bilbo progresses east, we get to see this series of thresholds, even as he crosses the bridge. And those thresholds are very different when Frodo travels east because, well, in part, the tone and register of the book is very different. But also, he takes a very different route. We get the direct passage from Buckland into the Old Forest, which is a stark transition that Bilbo didn't have to undergo. The idea, reading The Hobbit, of a forest as wild, as unpredictable, as potent as the Old Forest, so close to the Shire, would have felt a little strange, I think, layered over our understanding of Bilbo's progression in The Hobbit. But within the frame of The Lord of the Rings, it makes a lot of sense. The Barrow Downs, perhaps even more so. The Barrow Downs are extraordinary, taken from the civil, Hobbit-friendly perspective of the first book. I like that we're moving the trolls further east, and I like that we compress the journey to the ford, which is, of course, the reason why we're moving the trolls further east, is because we want to have that encounter and that moment of respite, you know, delayed in the narrative, and then we want the sharp juxtaposition between that moment of respite, in particular of Sam's song, and then the appearance of Glorfindel, the attack by the Black Riders, the arrival at the ford itself. We want that to be compressed. We don't want 6 days of travel between those two things. So we move the 6 days of travel a little to the west here. That, for me, makes a lot of sense. And I don't think that I would want the 1960 or a theoretical 1966, 1968 revision of The Hobbit to replace the original text, but it would have been very interesting, I think, to get an expanded, longer perspective on Bilbo's journey in the tone of The Lord of the Rings than we get in either Unfinished Tales or in The Quest of Erebor in the appendices here. Let me look at the YouTube chat here. One of the great things about Crowdcast, by the way, for future broadcasts on Point North Media, is that Crowdcast doesn't have a lag between the live video and the YouTube chat, which is pretty great, I have to say. Let me see here. Sabrina says, I have no sense of direction in life, and obviously that's true when I'm reading fiction too, because I had zero idea of any of this. I think that's completely fair. The account that we get of Frodo's passage, is a little bewildering. For me, it works really rather well in this chapter because of the building desperation that we get in the prose. When we get that great description of them finding the little valley that is heading southeast, and they follow the valley, and then it comes to a dead end, and they can't climb the hill. Frodo can't climb the hill, so they have to retrace their steps. I am, my heart is in my throat, and my pulse is pounding at that point because of the desperation that it instills. That's, for me, very effective, but I completely understand, the apparently endless accounts of traversing the countryside in the first part of the Fellowship of the Ring can be somewhat off-putting to some readers. Yeah, you really have to, I think, love this landscape. You have to love this world, and to love, I think, exactly those demarcations between civil and uncivil that I discussed earlier. We have the Old Forest, and we have the Barrow Downs, and then we have Bree, which is an odd beat in terms of our smooth graph progressing from civil to uncivil. Then we have Weathertop, and we have technically the Midgewater Marshes, and then we have Weathertop, and then we have the Last Bridge, and then we have the Trollshaws, and then we have the Ford of Brunnen, and we are getting closer and closer to the wild. The world is literally becoming more dangerous with every step that they take, and that is only exacerbated by the presence of the Black Riders, who we will see in what is by far their most effective, their most intimidating manifestation at the end of this chapter. That may seem like an odd thing to say, I suppose, because we just saw one of them stab Frodo. We just saw the Witch King of Angmar, leader of the Nazgul, leader of the Nine, stab Frodo on the top of Weathertop. So maybe that's, I'm exaggerating a little when I say that this is their most potent manifestation, but there is a beat right there at the end of this chapter, which will get to an hour and a half from now, in which the Witch King of Angmar, I think, demonstrates his true power. That's going to be fun to discuss. Let's see here. Galadriel says, I always have to flip back and forth to see the maps. I have to say, Tolkien is the author who taught me to do that. When I grew up reading fantasy literature, I would basically never read the maps until I had kind of absorbed The Lord of the Rings. And now, just like you, I always have my index finger tucked right there at the very front of the book for the map. It isn't a real fantasy novel unless it has a carefully composed map right at the beginning, is what I'm saying. Okay. Let's get into it then with our discussion of this week's reading, with Frodo waking in the aftermath of the attack. When Frodo came to himself, he was still clutching the ring desperately. He was lying by the fire, which was now piled high and burning brightly. His 3 companions were bending over him. What has happened? Where's the Pale King? He asked wildly. They were too overjoyed to hear him speak to answer for a little while, nor did they understand his question. At length, he gathered from Sam that they had seen nothing but the vague, shadowy shapes coming towards them. Suddenly, to his horror, Sam found that his master had vanished, and at that moment a black shadow rushed past him and he fell. He heard Frodo's voice, but it seemed to come from a great distance, or from under the earth, crying out strange words. They saw nothing more until they stumbled over the body of Frodo, lying as if dead, face downward on the grass with his sword beneath him. Strider ordered them to pick him up and lay him by the fire, and then he disappeared. That was now a good while ago. Sam plainly was beginning to have doubts again about Strider, but while they were talking, he returned, appearing suddenly out of the shadows. They started, and Sam drew his sword and stood over Frodo. But Strider knelt down swiftly at his side. I'm not a Black Rider, Sam, he said gently, nor in league with them. I have been trying to discover something of their movements, but I have found nothing. I cannot think why they have gone and do not attack again, but there is no feeling of their presence anywhere at hand. Can we, for a moment, celebrate Sam Gamgee? I know that we can. I know that we are predisposed to celebrate Sam Gamgee at every possible moment, but it is fantastic to see him here in this moment when they have been attacked by shadowy figures, when Frodo lay as if dead and is now rousing from sleep next to the campfire, and Strider returns out of the shadows, and Sam draws his sword. This is a moment of unparalleled courage and heroism from Sam. Unparalleled, I should say, only in the context of the story so far. This is a great, great Sam moment. So what has happened to Frodo? Well, we get a different perspective. We basically get Sam's perspective on the events at Weathertop. He didn't see clearly the coming shadows. He didn't see clearly the coming Nazgul, and he certainly didn't see the Pale King. He didn't see them revealed in their true form as Frodo did when he wore the ring. But he did see the rushing shadow, and he did discover Frodo fallen. Suddenly, to his horror, Sam found that his master had vanished. Well, that's the putting on of the ring. And at that moment, a black shadow rushed past him and he fell. He heard Frodo's voice, but it seemed to come from a great distance or from under the earth, crying out strange words. Are the strange words that Frodo cried out Albereth Gilthoniel? Would Sam not have recognized these elven words? I mean, particularly after the meeting with Gildor's folk, when Frodo explains, oh, they're singing about Albereth, they're singing about Gilthoniel, they must be high elves. Would Sam not remember those words? Are those words themselves corrupted or distorted by Frodo's entry into the otherworldly, ring-compatible Wraith world? Well, possibly. Certainly they're coming from a great distance, which suggests for the first time that the bearer of the ring, that the wearer of the ring is transported in some sense, that it isn't just an invisibility ring. It is a ring that makes you different, that it pulls you into another realm, and thus you are separated from this realm by a real effect. They saw nothing more until they stumbled over the body of Frodo, lying as if dead, face downwards on the grass with his sword beneath him. Again, just to note here, we talked about this a little bit last time, but the detail is important. Frodo has been stabbed in the shoulder, but if you have seen the Peter Jackson adaptations of this story, it is important to remember that Frodo was not stabbed in the chest as much as he was stabbed in the back. This was a blow from behind because Frodo, while he was attacking the Witch King of Angmar, while he was attacking the leader of the Nazgul, he did fall, he did falter, and we're going to see a little more about that in a moment. So Strider returns, kneels by Frodo. I'm not a Black Rider, Sam, he said gently, nor in league with them. I've been trying to discover something of their movements, but I have found nothing. I cannot think why they have gone, do not attack again, but there is no feeling of their presence anywhere at hand. Again, we get a suggestion that we can feel the Nazgul, that we can sense the Black Riders, that there is a fear and a despair that comes over you when the Black Riders are near. But what is really interesting here is that the hobbits in particular, and Strider too, I'm sure, must also be feeling in this moment a certain amount of fear and despair. This suggests that the effect of the Nazgul, I'm just going to adjust my camera just a little bit there because it is awfully slanted and it's bothering me quite a bit. There we go. It is clear here, I think, that the effect of the Nazgul, the aura of the Nazgul is in fact distinct from actual feelings of fear and despair. Those are perhaps the closest analogies. It is something in that direction. It is something of that order, but it isn't quite the same because it is distinct. It seems to be distinct and at least unfocused. Josh says here in the YouTube chat, and I am inclined to agree, Aragorn's patience with Sam is touching, though, always gently reassuring without any note of anger or exasperation, which is, of course, exactly what we should expect from Aragorn, son of Arathorn, heir of Isildur. We're getting already some references that the careful reader will be able to parse. We will already understand a little more about Aragorn by the end of this chapter. There is a very casual line that is just thrown in as we're discussing the Etmors, as we're discussing this part of the world that definitely, you know, implies something very powerful about who Aragorn is, about what Aragorn is. We're not quite there yet, but I mean, it's basically impossible to know. Right? It's basically impossible not to know, I should say, that Aragorn is of royal blood, of royal lineage. And we're seeing here a great example, a great manifestation of exactly the kind of condescension that we discussed all the way back in The Hobbit. Aragorn will condescend to Sam. That is an incredibly noble thing, because we have to remember in the social hierarchy of Middle-earth, Aragorn is actually about as good as it gets. Strider is about as high as you can possibly be here. And Sam is about as low. There is, no, there's basically no caste. There's no social order of the civil races of Middle-earth, at least, that would be lower than blue-collar hobbits. I mean, Sam is about as working class as it gets, and Aragorn is about as noble as it gets. And the fact that Aragorn will absolutely speak to Sam not as an equal, not crucially as an equal. This isn't an egalitarian relationship. This isn't a denial of this, you know, again, within the frame of Tolkien, objective truth of social hierarchy and social order. But Strider's ability to cross that boundary, his willingness to cross that boundary, is an excellent example of kingly condescension. That's something that we associate with the genuinely great kings, and also noblemen of a lesser order. I think we also see a version of that with Frodo. We saw a version of that with Bilbo back in The Hobbit. Even Merry and Pippin to a certain degree, though they will always tease Sam a little more than Frodo will. They will also tease Frodo a little more. So this is not to suggest that this is just about social order. This is also about Merry and Pippin just being smartasses, I think. But they will tease Sam a little more than Frodo will. Frodo will more willingly condescend there. Condescending in the best way ever, says Becca Eller. Yes, yes. Oh, this is interesting. Yes, good call, Skipa. Skipa says, Bilbo wore the ring for a long time when they were trapped by the elves and didn't mention anything about distorted language. Granted, retcons are a thing in Lord of the Rings. That's true, but I wonder if the dwarves, having heard Bilbo speak while he was invisible, would have heard anything different. And I do think, too, that we can... one of the most effective pieces of adaptation in the Peter Jackson double trilogy, it's not quite a 6-part story, but it is a double trilogy at least, is the suggestion that the ring grows in power as Sauron himself grows in power in the Tower of Barad-dûr in Mordor. So there is a possible interpretation there that the ring, when Bilbo held it, was not all that it is now. And certainly on the top of Weathertop at night with the Nazgul attacking, it's very possible that Frodo is more deeply ensnared in the Wraith realm, or in whatever we call this alternate world that lays parallel to our own, or this drawing out of the natural world. It's possible that Frodo's a little more deeply caught in that than Bilbo ever was. Princess Ulster says, don't you say anything bad about my Merry and Pippin here. Hey, now, Merry and Pippin are lovely folks, but they are kind of snarky. They're kind of sarcastic, which I think is one of the reasons that we like them the most, honestly. Yes. Good. All right. Nikki says, this is interesting. I think the simple fact that Strider is a ranger shows that he is humble. This is very interesting because, of course, Strider's role as ranger is not strictly occupational in the frame of the Lord of the Rings. That is to say that being a ranger is not really his job as much as it is his identity. Now, of course, going out into the world and working with Gandalf to protect the Shire and doing all the things that he does, that is his job. But that is distinct from his I was going to say role as ranger, but I guess identity as ranger is probably more accurate. Particularly in the initial drafts of The Lord of the Rings, the Rangers were just, this is politically incorrect, but I'm going to say this because Tolkien was writing this in the middle of the 20th century, and such politically incorrect thoughts had not yet become, problematic in the way that they are today. But he's talking about gypsies. He's talking in part about that kind of nomadic, itinerant culture. The Rangers range because they don't have homes, because they're traveling from place to place. They have encampments, but they don't have villages and towns and cities. Those things are gone. The Dunedain are of the wild in a way that the settled folk of the Shire, even the settled folk of the Breland, are not. So that's interesting. Certainly, Strider exhibits a great deal of humility. Even the name Strider, which is slightly kind of what is it? What is the name Strider? It is perhaps a little too informal. It is perhaps a little too friendly. It suggests a kind of a primary physicality, which I think is at odds with Aragorn's lineage and presence. Even the adoption of that name and the willingness to use that name is an interesting thing. Yeah, good. Also, Rangers sounds cooler than stay-at-homers, says it don't connect. I'm kind of into that. Sheena says, Rangers gonna range. Yes, good. Excellent. All right, so let's move on and get to the Morgul blade. Let's get to the actual wound that has been inflicted upon Frodo. Sam choked with tears. Don't despair, said Strider. You must trust me now. Your Frodo is made of sterner stuff than I had guessed, though Gandalf hinted that it might prove so. He is not slain. And I think he will resist the evil power of them longer than his enemies expect. I will do all I can to help and heal him, guard him well while I am away. He hurried off and disappeared again into the darkness. Frodo dozed, though the pain of his wound was slowly growing and a deadly chill was spreading from his shoulder to his arm and side. His friends watched over him, warming him and bathing his wound. The night passed slowly and wearily. Dawn was growing in the sky and the dell was filling with grey light when Strider at last returned. Look, he cried, and stooping he lifted from the ground a black cloak that had lain there hidden by the darkness. A foot above the lower hem there was a slash. This was the stroke of Frodo's sword, he said. The only hurt that it did to his enemy, I fear, for it is unharmed. But all blades perish that pierce the dreadful king. More deadly to him was the name of Albereth. And more deadly to Frodo was this. He stopped again and lifted up a long, thin knife. There was a cold gleam in it. As Strider raised it, they saw that near the end its edge was notched and the point was broken off. But even as he held it up in the growing light, they gazed in astonishment, for the blade seemed to melt and vanish like a smoke in the air, leaving only the hilt in Strider's hand. Alas, he cried, it was this accursed knife that gave the wound. You now have the skill in healing to match such evil weapons. But I will do what I can. So this is the Morgul blade. This is known as the Morgul blade. This is the knife that is apparently used by all of the Nazgul, but in The Lord of the Rings, the book, we only have absolute confirmation that the Witch King of Angmar, the leader of the Nazgul, carries it. Morgul here means dark sorcery, and it is repeated later in the story in the name of Minas Morgul, which is the tower that stands on the border between Gondor and Mordor itself. So this is the meaning of the Morgul blade. And we see here, well, we see a couple of things. We see first that the point has broken off, which is enormously suggestive of the wound that Frodo has suffered. Then we see that it melts. Why does it melt when Aragorn lifts it? Well, It could be the presence of Aragorn, but it seems to be more likely that it is the presence of the sun, that it too lay concealed in the darkness, or lay concealed beneath the dark cloak of the Black Rider, and it is only exposure to light that has robbed the blade of its essence, that has dissolved it fundamentally. Yes, good. God, sorry. Catching up with the YouTube chat here as you're, yes. Yes, Becca asks, isn't it the same blade as the Jabberwocky? The Morgul knife, the Morgul blade is not quite the same as the Vorpal sword. No, those are slightly different. I see where you're going with that. I see where you're going. Yes, and of course, there are connections too. That makes a lot of sense. We see too here as Strider finds the cloak that has fallen from the Witch King of Angmar, the slash that is in it. This was the stroke of Frodo's sword. He said, the only hurt that it did to his enemy, I fear. That is to say that the only hurt that Frodo did was carving through the cloak. For it is unharmed, but all blades perish that pierce the dreadful king. More deadly to him was the name of Elbereth. Here we see again the power of names and of song to basically evoke light in the same way that the Nazgul are driven off by fire, by daylight, or at least weakened by daylight. Names that embody light also seem to have that effect. And now we may understand a little more clearly why it was the Black Rider moved on so swiftly when he presumably heard Gildor's party approaching way back in the Shire, for they were singing of Elbereth. They were singing that song that Frodo immediately identified as a song of the High Elves. This is clearly a name of power. But once again, we have to look at Frodo's action. He didn't buckle. He didn't cower. He didn't surrender. He took action. It was action driven by good fortune, by chance, if chance you call it. This was a moment of opportunity for Frodo, and just like Bilbo, he took it, and that has saved his life, as we'll discover when we get to Rivendell. Yes, good. Let me see here. As I'm scrolling back, the conversation in the YouTube chat tonight is flowing fast, let me tell you. There are only 30 of you here tonight, but this is moving swiftly. Yes, good. All right. We'll come back to any questions. Any questions you may have later, we can jump. We can cover as they come up. So now we have the sense that Frodo has been infected by this sorceress blade, by this Morgul knife, and this is worrisome immediately. And clearly, Strider is worried. Alas, he cried, it was this accursed knife that gave the wound. Few now have the skill and healing to match such evil weapons, but I will do what I can. And what he can, it turns out, is actually quite a lot. Let's move on to the next slide. This is a short one. These leaves, he said, I have walked far to find, for this plant does not grow in the bare hills, but in the thickets away south of the road. I have found it in the dark by the scent of its leaves. He crushed a leaf in his fingers, and it gave out a sweet and pungent fragrance. It is fortunate that I could find it, for it is a healing plant that the men of the West brought to Middle-earth. Athelas, they named it, for it grows now sparsely and only near places where they dwelt or camped of old, and it is not known in the north, except to some of those who wander in the wild. It has great virtues, but over such a wound as this, its healing powers may be small. So this is the first pull of Athelas. Stay tuned for more. Athelas, I guess, is going to come back later. It is formed of two Sindarin terms, two terms in the Elven tongue Sindarin. Athaya meaning helpful or beneficial, and las meaning leaf. So it is just the beneficial leaf, Athelas. And this is related to, of course, older traditions in actual real world medieval Western European history of certain plants that were touched by Kingsfoil, of course, being one of the most important. Yes, good. This then is we can also say too, this will be used by Aragorn later in the book multiple times. He will use Athelas, but it also calls back to our discussion of Beren and Luthien last time. Athelas was also used by Luthien to heal the wounded Beren. This is in, I think, gosh, it's a very early version of the Lay of Leithian. I think it might even be the first version of the Lay of Leithian. That is actually somewhat in conflict here because Aragorn specifically says that it was brought to Middle-earth by the men of the West, that is to say the Númenórean. This is the great line of men from whom Aragorn himself is descended. And that happened after the story of Beren and Luthien, but that's not a problem for the here and the now of the story. It is just a significant thing here. Yes, Tolkien and his plant thing strikes again, says Heroes and Bards. Yes, and Skipa points out that everything sounds better in Sindarin. Absolutely. Good. Yes, good. Princess Ostrich says, I always thought it was very funny that other people just know it as weeds, because if it was so rare, no one would complain about it as weeds. That's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought of that, but you're right. It is a humble plant, and that is, of course, entirely in keeping with Tolkien's perspective on where true power and virtue can be found within the realm of Middle-earth. Excellent. Kathy Astrom says, or Astrom possibly says, I feel a pedantic urge to break out in multiple terms for Athelas for some strange reason. By all means do. By all means do. Just pull that stuff out right here in the YouTube chat. Yes. This is a very common medieval kind of icon, I suppose. It is a symbol of naturalistic healing, as opposed to sorcerer's healing or miraculous healing. This is a world that is touched by magic but is not in itself inherently magical. And certainly it is suggested by Aragorn here in this encounter that it is partly practice. He essentially brews a tea. He brews a concoction of the leaves of the Althalas, but then, crucially, he applies it and sings over it. And that seems to be significant, too, that it isn't just this plant. It isn't just the application of the plant that does wonders. It is, in part, the plant, and in part, Aragorn's song, and presumably, as we will discover later in the book, Aragorn, that's actually, I suppose, open to interpretation. We may discover later in the book that it is also Aragorn's lineage and personage that is responsible for the healing, or alternatively, he could just be fulfilling a prophecy. Either one of those may be true by the time that we get to the end of the book. Good. As Stephen Brown says, I'm Scottish. Tea makes everything better. Medical fact. I'm inclined to agree, Stephen. I'm inclined to agree. Good. All right. Let me keep moving on then, because we have a lot of ground to cover before we get to the bridge, before we get to the trolls, before we get to the ford of Bruinen. Before the first day's march was over, Frodo's pain began to grow again, and he did not speak of it for a long time. 4 days passed without the ground or the scene changing much, except that behind them weathertop slowly sank, and before them the distant mountains loomed a little nearer. Yet since that far cry they had seen and heard no sign that the enemy had marked their flight or followed them. They dreaded the dark hours and kept watch in pairs by night, expecting at any time to see black shapes stalking in the grey night, dimly lit by the cloud-veiled moon. But they saw nothing, and heard no sound but the sigh of withered leaves and grass. Not once did they feel the sense of present evil that had assailed them before the attack in the dell. It seemed too much to hope that the riders had already lost their trail again. Perhaps they were waiting to make some ambush in a narrow place. At the end of the 5th day, the ground began once more to rise slowly out of the wide, shallow valley into which they had descended. Strider now turned their course again northeastwards, and on the 6th day they reached the top of the long, slow-climbing slope and saw far ahead a huddle of wooded hills. Away below them they could see the road sweeping round the feet of the hills, and to their right a grey river gleamed pale in the thin sunshine. In the distance they glimpsed yet another river in a stony valley, half veiled in mist. I'm afraid we must go back to the road here for a while, said Strider. We have now come to the river Horwell, that the elves called Mithaethal. It flows down out of the Etten Moors, the Trollfells north of Rivendell, and joins the Loudwater away in the south. Some call it the Grey Flood after that. It is great water before it finds the sea. There is no way over it, below its sources in the Etten Moors, except by the last bridge on which the road crosses. What is the other river we can see far away there? Asked Mary. That is Loudwater, the Bruinen of Rivendell, answered Strider. The road runs along the edge of the hills for many miles from the bridge to the ford of Bruinen. I have not yet thought how we shall cross that water, one river at a time. We shall be fortunate indeed if we do not find the last bridge held against us. This is another minor detail of geographical inconsistency here. It is surprising that standing before the Horwater, but standing before the Horwell, I should say, the Elven River Mithaethal, that they should be able to see the Bruinen too. That's about 100 miles. And some cartographers have attempted to revise Tolkien's work ever so slightly, pulling the Bruinen closer, kind of allowing a loop of the Bruinen to closer to the Hobbit position here, but that hasn't really stuck. So we have to just assume that they are perhaps higher up than we thought that they were. So what do we see here? Well, mostly this is just geography. Mostly we're just getting a sense of the ground that they're covering, but we're also getting a sense of these thresholds that await them, one river at a time. That's of crucial importance. Here, as we're moving east, I should say too, here, this first paragraph, since that far cry, the team heard signs that the enemy had marked their flight or followed them, they dreaded the dark hours and kept what in pairs by night. What in pairs by night is interesting, because there are, excluding Frodo, who is wounded, 4 people in this party. I choose to believe that Merry and Pippin watched together, and Strider and Sam watched together. I like that idea. I like the idea that Strider and Sam just sat up nights watching, just caring for the camp. So I would also perhaps not be surprised if Sam didn't sleep much during this journey. Good. So this is our journey east. We see the coming of the Horwell, which the elves fell. It flows down from the Ettenmoors. The Trollfells north of Rivendell joins the Loudwater in the south. Some call it the Grey Flood after that, because nothing in Middle-earth has only one name. It is a great water before it finds the sea. This serves in part to focus our attention on the last bridge. We know now that we are going to cross the last bridge. And there at the end of the first paragraph, we see a narrative intrusion which is a little unusual. It seemed too much to hope that the writers had already lost the trail again. Perhaps they were waiting to make some ambush in a narrow place. Oh, like the last bridge crossing the Horwell? Is that possible? Would that be a fine place to attack them? Well, yes, of course it would. So the narrative here is setting up our expectation of imminent attack. It's assuaging our fears in a way that the writers are hot on the heels of Frodo and company, but it is instead foreshadowing an imminent attack that will ultimately not come. The Princess Australia says, no, Strider and Sam are not just standing there, they're discussing soil and fertilizers. Well, as well they might. As well they might, yes. Good. Let's see here as we move on. Oh, are we getting some... we might be getting some video problems. Let me try and rectify this here, and hopefully the video will come back. You can try hitting refresh if the video has gone. It may just spontaneously return. Technical problems on YouTube, you guys. This is why we are thinking about moving to another broadcast platform. It's just fine. No, apparently it's all shot. There isn't really much that I can do. Okay, it seems to be returning now. That's fine. Okay. That's good. I'm glad to hear it. My apologies, you guys. Again, this is why we're going to be switching to a new broadcast platform sooner rather than later. As we move through this land then, Merry has a question for Strider. Who lives in this land? He asked. And who built these towers? Is this troll country? No, said Strider. Trolls do not build. No one lives in this land. Men once dwelt here ages ago, but none remain now. They became an evil people, as legends tell, for they fell under the shadow of Angmar. But all were destroyed in the war that brought the North Kingdom to its end. But that is now so long ago that the hills have forgotten them, though a shadow still lies on the land. Where did you learn such tales if all the land is empty and forgetful? Asked Peregrine. The birds and beasts do not tell tales of that sort. The heirs of Elendil do not forget all things past, said Strider, and many more things I can tell. Many more things than I can tell are remembered in Rivendell. Have you often been to Rivendell? Said Frodo. I have, said Strider. I dwelt there once, and still I return when I may. There my heart is, but it is not my fate to sit in peace even in the fair house of Elrond. Heroes and bards called out in the YouTube chat, Angmar! Yes, there it is. Good. And at least it all seems better. The broadcast seems better. I'm hoping that this will hold up. Yes, YouTube just not really serving us as well as it might. YouTube proving a poor servant. YouTube could take a page from Sam Gamgee's book, let me tell you. So here we get a brief account of this part of Eriador. The men here fell to evil. They fell under the shadow of Angmar. How many times have we heard that used as a metaphor for corruption and the turning to darkness? They fell under a shadow and became evil here. They were destroyed in the war that brought the North Kingdom to its end, but now that it's so long ago, the hills have forgotten them, though a shadow still lies on the land. Though, of course, we know that that isn't entirely true. The hills are perhaps the only thing besides the heirs of Elendil and elves who remember the North Kingdom, because as we learn in this passage, the hilltops are studded with castle outcroppings and fortresses and walls across the hills. There are still strategic positions here, relics of the kingdom of Arnor, relics of the kingdom of Angmar. There are still scars left on the landscape by that ancient conflict. But what is much more important here, well, there are two important things. The first, the heirs of Elendil do not forget all things past, said Strider. Okay, let's put a note in that and remember that Strider is an heir of Elendil. That is going to be very, very important later. But then, have you often been to Rivendell, said Frodo. I have, said Strider. I dwelt there once, and still I return when I may. There my heart is, but it is not my fate to sit in peace, even in the fair house of Elrond. And I want to look, as is my way, at that concluding semicolon in that last conjoined phrase that Strider utters. There my heart is, but it is not my fate to sit in peace, even in the fair house of Elrond. The use of a semicolon there suggests a continuation of metaphor, a continuation of subject between one clause and the next. There my heart is, but it is not my fate to sit in peace. To what degree might we infer from this that for all of his capability, for all of his ranger ways out here in the wild, Strider's heart, metaphorically speaking, is found in or associated with peace? Or do we read this another way? Do we see that division and conflict have, not division and conflict within Rivendell, but division and conflict in the world, have driven Aragorn out of his peaceful home at Rivendell, but his heart still lingers there? This is the first real beat that we get, drawing a profound connection between Aragorn and Rivendell. We know that they're associated, of course, but this is much more important. And of course, for those of you who listened as we discussed Bilbo's journey to Rivendell during The Hobbit, Aragorn was there as a boy when Bilbo was there too. He was a young child, but he was still there. Aragorn, as we've discussed previously, older than you might think. Oh, that's good. Josh says he's a mortal man doomed to die. That's a lovely call out here. Yes, I dwelt there once and still I return when I may. There my heart is, but it is not my fate to sit in peace even in the fair house of Elrond. Josh, I hadn't considered that as a third possible interpretation, that the house of Elrond is, for all that the elves are leaving Middle-earth, for all that magic is departing the world, the house of Elrond is still a bastion of timelessness, and Aragorn, as a mortal man, cannot simply pass his days in indolence. He can't simply sit among the manicured gardens of Rivendell because his time is short. Not terribly short by our standards, perhaps. Aragorn, as we said, will be, okay, minor spoilers, Aragorn will live a good long time. But he can't simply pass his years in Rivendell. That's beautiful. Yes, good. And Kathy's calling out the inevitable, and I don't feel too bad jumping ahead to this because we're going to hit it within the next couple of weeks. Arwen is not available without Aragorn's conflicts in the outer world. We are, of course, in part talking about Arwen, the daughter of Elrond. I mentioned last time when we were discussing Beren and Luthien that Luthien is described as the fairest woman ever, that she is the most beautiful woman in all of Middle-earth, and that is a title that's been given by Tolkien twice and twice alone. The first time to Luthien, the second time to Arwen, the daughter of Elrond. And for those of you who are not reading ahead, the love interest, what is the word that I'm looking for? Let's settle for something completely inappropriate and say girlfriend. The girlfriend of Aragorn, son of Arathorn. As we mentioned, they are both descended from Beren and Luthien themselves. Yeah. Heroes and Bards gives us a heartbreaking little moment. This is the fan fiction I want to read. Little Aragorn watching Bilbo coming home from his adventure. Yes. Good. Fina's bailing because it is almost 4 a.m. Fina, I applaud your commitment. Go back to sleep. Have a good sleep and hopefully listen to the podcast and catch up. Yes. Oh, this is interesting. Glorfindel David asks, do elves look the same their entire immortal lives, or do they show visible signs of aging as they age? Apparently not. No, they do mature, and they mature slowly, but that's about it. There's no suggestion that the elves themselves deteriorate, not even in the way that Gandalf does at a very at a decelerated pace. The elves appear to be beautiful and immortal, though there is, of course, always an agelessness associated with them, so they may not ever look young. Even young elves, whatever that means, may not ever look young. Good. All right, let's keep moving on and get to the trolls. I just realized that I left that whole slide up. I left that slide up for that whole discussion, and that's just fine. There stood the trolls, 3 large trolls. One was stooping, and the other 2 stood staring at him. Strider walked forward unconcernedly. "Get up, old stone," he said, and broke his stick upon the stooping troll. Nothing happened. There was a gasp of astonishment from the hobbits, and then even Frodo laughed. "Well," he said, "we're forgetting our family history. These must be the very 3 that were caught by Gandalf quarreling over the right way to cook 13 dwarves and 1 hobbit." "Hey, no idea we were anywhere near the place," said Pippin. He knew the story well. Bilbo and Frodo had told it often, but as a matter of fact, he had never more than half believed it. Even now, he looked at the stone trolls with suspicion, wondering if some magic might not suddenly bring them to life again. You're forgetting not only your family history, but all you ever knew about trolls," said Strider. "It is broad daylight with a bright sun, and yet you come back trying to scare me with a tale of live trolls waiting for us in this glade. In any case, you might have noticed that one of them has an old bird's nest behind his ear. That would be a most unusual ornament for a live troll." They all laughed. Frodo felt his spirits reviving. The reminder of Bilbo's first successful adventure was heartening. The sun, too, was warm and comforting, and the mist before his eyes seemed to be lifting a little. They rested for some time in the glade and took their midday meal right under the shadow of the troll's large legs. Nikki B says, "This scene made me laugh. Aragorn is, wait for it, trolling." Very nice. Very nice. So here we tie back The Lord of the Rings directly to the events of The Hobbit. Now, of course, we're going to do that a number of times. We have already, in a way, done that, in the course of the story. Bree and the Prancing Pony certainly have connective tissue back to The Hobbit. But this is the first time that Frodo's adventure has intersected with Bilbo's adventure. And this works for me really rather beautifully, because we're reminded by Pippin in particular here. Though Frodo had told it often, but as a matter of fact, he had never more than half believed it. What's crucial in that sentiment is that Bilbo and Frodo had told the story of Bilbo's encounter with the trolls. This is how fairy tales happen. Bilbo told this story, and then it was taken up and told again and again and again. And while it may be emotionally true, while it may be significant and, I dare say, entertaining, it kind of loses an applicability to real life. We can't really blame Pippin for failing to believe that it was any more than half true, but here it is. This is the evidence. And we mustn't forget that this was, in a sense, Bilbo's first successful adventure. Here we are, back in the Trollglade, crossing paths with an adventure that had a very successful outcome. We get all of this detail, even the little path, the cave, of course, the door to the cave, the stone door to the cave, now hanging off one of its hinges. That wasn't the case when Thorin and company left this place behind, but now it is. We even get a brief reference to the scratched dwarf runes, and we know that when Gandalf and Bilbo returned from the Lonely Mountain in the east, they stopped here to recover the gold that they buried, and then they took it back to the Shire, where we learned Bilbo gave most of it away because he didn't want to be the holder of stolen gold. Bilbo there demonstrating again that kingly virtue of generosity, that noble virtue of generosity. Josh says, Tolkien showing that laughter is the best medicine. That's a very good pull here. What this reminds me of more than anything, let's look at that last paragraph. They all laughed. Frodo felt his spirits reviving. The reminder of Bilbo's first successful adventure was heartening. The sun, too, was warm and comforting, and the mist before his eyes seemed to be lifting a little. They rested for some time in the glade and took their midday meal right under the shadow of the troll's large legs. This reminds me of nothing more than immediately after the adventure with the Barrow-wights, where Tom encourages them, all but commands them to go run around in the sunlight, go lay down on the warm grass, go reconnect to light and life and the natural world, because that is the foil of the enemy. That will prevent the darkness from lingering within you. We see here that, as we've seen before, this is a recurring motif in Tolkien's work, that despair and sadness and fear are as much weapons of the shadow, weapons of the enemy, as the knives of the Nazgul or any other weapon which they may care to wield later in the story. Laughter and light and fire and joy and camaraderie and song, these are the best weapons with which we can fight that foul influence. Thus we get again another perspective on the special nature of the Shire, because the Shire is a place of light and song and good food and good company and camaraderie in that sense. It works beautifully there. Laughter is light and life and innocence, says Nikki. I like that very much. Good. Good. Good pull there. Yes, I'm having terrible trouble keeping up with the YouTube chat here tonight because it's I just think it's having trouble buffering here. This may be our last time using YouTube, you guys. I think that's where we are. Heroes and Bard says, I love the idea of Bilbo telling the Hobbit children the story about the trolls, which is, you know, part of what we talked about way back at the beginning of our discussion of the Lord of the Rings, the influence that Bilbo has had on the next generation of hobbits. You know, all of these hobbits have heard his stories, and this is presumably part of the reason why they are now more eager to engage with adventure in the first place. You know, we get various suggestions that adventures are not now as inconceivable as they would have been back in Bilbo's time. From there, we move into Sam's song, and I'm not going to quote Sam's song here because because it's kind of incidental. Sam's song is this is the root of the boot, or boot and bottom depending on the version. This was actually written in the mid 1930s by Tolkien. This is one of two poems that has been kind of co-opted for the Lord of the Rings. The first, of course, was the song that Frodo sang back in The Prancing Pony, the Man in the Moon Came Down Too Soon song. The song that Frodo originally sang back in The Prancing Pony was this song, but Tolkien then decided to switch them out and move this to the more relevant position in the text, that is up against the trolls themselves. So this song was originally written and collated, I suppose. This is collated into what is the hardest Tolkien book to find. In 1936, these were put together and they were printed in handset type as an exercise on a reconstructed wooden hand press. This is a number of songs gathered and written by Tolkien and by E.V. Gordon for the students at Leeds University. This was the Songs for the Philologists volume. There were never many because the guy who printed them, this is A.H. Smith, had not asked permission from Gordon or Tolkien. So he printed some copies of this book, the Songs for the Philologists, but then didn't distribute them because that would be morally wrong because he hadn't asked permission to print them. And then, during the Second World War, the University College in Leeds was bombed, and most of the copies of Songs for the Philologists were lost. There are, it is thought, between 12 and 14 extant copies in the world today. But much more importantly, and I've just realized that I've left the slide up again, and I'll come back to you now. Much more importantly, though we are not going to cover the song here in the live session, I am going to paste into the YouTube chat and will include in the show notes for the podcast version of this episode. This is a link to the professor reading the poem himself, and it is, gosh, you guys, it's actually pretty delightful. I have to say, it's actually pretty delightful. Good. So Nikki says, so do you think Bilbo saw the trolls on the way to Rivendell or Dale? They must have been so special to him. That's an interesting thought, isn't it? We don't get mention of Bilbo's direct journey. I would think probably not. The reason, well, I guess, it may have been a little difficult for them to find. Bilbo and the dwarves were in the first place led to the trolls' camp because of the light on the hillside. Though I suppose Bilbo and Gandalf did manage to find their way back there again afterward. I genuinely don't know. I like to think that he would have stopped by and also picnicked under the stone form of the trolls here. That would have been good. Yeah. Okay. I'm pulling back here to see. Yes, so we're seeing here, Chris says, let me see if I can find that original comment. I know we aren't supposed to compare this to the movie, but Frodo was way sicker in this scene in the movie. And then if I can scroll back down. Yes, Sabrina says, I kept thinking that reading this part of the book, they did a better job showing how incapacitated Frodo was in the movie. I'm inclined to agree. It's very difficult because this is the first time in the book, I think, where we've, for an extended period, where we've really deviated from Frodo's POV. We're not terribly close to Frodo at all right now. And I understand why, because Frodo's experience right now is pain and misery and fear and a feeling of disconnection. And I kind of like the intentionality that's associated with that. That is to say that as Frodo grows more and more grievously ill, he retreats further and further from the narrative itself. But then at the end of this chapter, we're going to crash back into Frodo's POV, and it's going to be a little difficult to align that with our sense of Frodo earlier in the chapter. So we kind of pull out from, I guess if you think of the end of chapter 11, we're right there in Frodo's POV during the attack. And then we're in Frodo's POV as he wakes, but not for very long and not very close. Then we're just out in this kind of omniscient third-person POV, which is a narrative voice that Tolkien uses throughout The Lord of the Rings. But here, because of the immediacy of Frodo's danger, it can feel more difficult to connect with him. I kind of understand why we get this. I understand why it is done, but I think you're right. The movie, by virtue of being, a visual medium, allows us to connect more immediately with Frodo's suffering. And I think certainly that's expanded, in the movies too. Gildart says, Alistair, what the blitz that took out? Okay, there's some grammatical snarling here. This may be autocorrect. Having fun with you, Gildart. Was it the blitz that took the writings of Tolkien out? Yes, the blitz during the Second World War destroyed, many libraries, many great buildings throughout Britain. By no means the worst atrocity committed in the war. By no means the most grave loss during the war. But when we're paying very close attention to the writings of J.R.R. Tolkien, a sadness nonetheless. Yeah. Good. Okay. Nikki says the movie had to speed up a lot of scenes, such as taking off from the Shire for time's sake. Peter Jackson's flexibility when it comes to both maps and calendars is interesting. There are a few moments in The Lord of the Rings when, and this is only true in part, I think, because of the care with which Tolkien himself approached these issues, but there are a few moments in The Lord of the Rings where you just kind of have to shrug or roll your eyes and say, okay, I have no idea how this is supposed to work in the time frame as it's presented to us. I'm just going to bip down to Orthanc for a minute and I'll be right back. Before you guys have even had time for breakfast, I'll just come right on back. But also, there is intentional compression too. We have to remember that in the novel, Gandalf is gone for 17 years after Frodo gets the ring. 17 years. Or I guess not gone entirely, but 17 years pass between Bilbo leaving the Shire and Frodo leaving the Shire. In the movies, it is unclear how much time has passed, but it can't be long, which makes Frodo's reunion with Bilbo at Rivendell a little more difficult to understand. It doesn't seem to be quite as important or quite as immediate. So it giveth and it taketh away, yes. Okay, let's see here as we move on to Glorfindel. How's the video? Is the video coming along? The video looks awful on my screen. I can only apologize, you guys. We'll press on as best we can and do what we can to figure this out. Okay, so let's move on to Glorfindel. Soon Strider beckoned to them, and the hobbits left the bushes and hurried down to the road. This is Glorfindel, who dwells in the house of Elrond, said Strider. Hail and well met at last, said the elf lord to Frodo. I was sent from Rivendell to look for you. We feared that you were endangered upon the road. Then Gandalf has reached Rivendell, said Frodo joyfully. No, he had not when I departed, and that was 9 days ago, answered Glorfindel. Elrond received news that troubled him. Some of my kindred journeying in your land beyond the Baron Dúin learned that things were amiss and sent messages as swiftly as they could. They said the Nine were abroad, and that you were astray, bearing a great burden without guidance, for Gandalf had not returned. Okay, we're getting bandwidth issues again. You guys, okay. I do apologize. Let me try and resurrect this. Okay, I don't know if that worked. Hopefully that worked. You guys.